Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are working our way through The Place of the Lion by Charles Williams. In fact, we are on to Chapter 7, Investigations into a Religion. Oh boy. Oh boy. So as always, let's talk about quickly what happened in this scenes. There's a couple things, and then let's try and talk about things in a little more detail. So, we actually start out this chapter not with Anthony, but with Mr. Rockbotham. Sorry, Dr. Rockbotham, who has just finished dinner with his wife and receives a calling card from Anthony, whom Mrs. Rockbotham remembers from the two camps, and so they all meet in the parlor. And Anthony pretends like his concern for Mr. Beringer is based on the two camps periodical. So there's sort of this awkward, polite conversation inquiring about him, and Dr. Rockbotham is like, don't suppose you know a solicitor or any family members that can make decisions. And Anthony's like, I don't know this man at all, dude. We were thinking about him writing some papers, and Mr. Rockbotham's like, I'm so glad my cousin listened to me, and Anthony's like, oh god, what have I done? And all of this culminates in Dr. Rockbotham inviting Anthony along to visit Mr. Beringer when he goes to do a checkup the next day, which Anthony says, I would be honored. He struggles a bit to find a word there because delighted, probably not appropriate. While Dr. Rockbotham leaves, poor Mr. Anthony is stuck still talking to Mrs. Rockbotham, so he tells her a little bit about the company, the two camps, and eventually manages to get the conversation back around to the little religious group that they have and the experience of Mrs. Wilmot. Ultimately, this gives Anthony the information about where Miss Wilmot lives, but also another mode of inquiry. Mrs. Rockbotham does admit that very close to where Miss Wilmot's house is a bookseller's whose assistant is part of the group, though he's not of the same social class. We'll get to that. We'll get to all of that. And Anthony manages to excuse himself to follow these two lines of inquiry. The first one is Richardson, the bookseller's assistant, whom Anthony approaches talking in code. He inquires about certain books about Gnostic religions and groups that might appear like them. Richardson seems to understand, because he says, well, we can't talk here, come by my room, it's 9:30, and I'm sorry we don't have that book. And Anthony is like, well, that's too bad, I'll take this one instead, and is forced to buy a random book he's picked up, because they are covering this conversation from Martin, the actual bookseller. I don't know why, but it's a thing that happens. And Anthony is forced to carry this book to his next mode of inquiry, that is the house of Miss Wilmot. He is escorted in by the maid, only to discover Miss Wilmot already has a guest. Mr. Foster is here. And neither of them are looking particularly hospitable. No, it seems that both Miss Wilmot and Mr. Foster have been possessed by a form or another. Miss Wilmot by her hissing S at one point, and the fact that she was the only one to see the crowned snake, likely the snake. Mr. Foster, well, we're not quite sure. We are told he acts in a violent manner, and Anthony assumes it is the lion, for his parting words to him is, give my love to the lion. Yeah, they're possessed by these forms and attack Anthony very directly. Again, Miss Wilmot in a more snake-like manner. She drops to the ground and sort of moves to restrict his legs. And Mr. Foster in a much more violent way, going for seemingly the jugular. But thanks to the book that Anthony has purchased, the sound of dropping it sort of snaps him out of the trance that he was in, and he's able to fend off these two people, at least long enough that the approach of the maid to the room stops everything dead, and everything just goes kind of back to normal, and Anthony again plays off the encounter as if it was completely normal. Just like in the booksellers, where he picked up the book and said, I guess I'll buy this anyways. He picks the book off the ground and he's like, oh yeah, no, it's a very good book. Thanks so much for the conversation, and walks out of the room. Now, he is a bit ruffled up. His collar has been torn, so he makes a biblical reference to St. Paul and the wild animals and leaves. And it is this chapter that the concept of this book, in a lot of ways, feels like the ankles are cut out from underneath it for me. Because the concept is already a really hard one to act out. The platonic forms, the great ideals of certain things, have entered into the human world, and we are already trying, like I've said in many of the past videos for The Place of the Lion, to describe something indescribable. Williams is trying to put into words something that is supposed to be so perfect and so complete and so utterly encapsulating of all of these ideas and thoughts and beings that human language is going to fail, obviously. But in this moment, I just become utterly frustrated because this chapter is so humanly based in some of the worst ways. And some of which we are supposed to, like, disdain along with Anthony. Anthony really is our viewpoint. He's the one we're supposed to be rooting for because he's the one facing down these ideals and remaining himself. But we've discussed the issues with that in previous videos, and I'll try not to retread that too much. But again, Thanks I Hate It encapsulates a whole bunch of it. Just Anthony Durant in general. But I recognize he is a symptom of the time and place that this book was being written. But for the fact that we're supposed to be working in these philosophical ranges up here, I have never felt so utterly dragged down into the petty and mundane and squabbling nature of humanity in, like, the worst ways. Because this entire chapter precisely sets up not that ascension. It is, in fact, a descent that is occurring. And I think we should go for the most obvious one, and then I'll try and draw in the bits and pieces that appear earlier in the chapter that augment the end part, which is meant to be the ascent, and it is, in fact, the descent. Which is to say that Miss Wilmot and Mr. Foster seem to have become one with certain ideals, certain forms. Well, then this is not... Either we have the complete wrong idea of what the forms are, or this is a real bad portrayal of them. Purely because the forms are meant to be the perfect thing, and then we get Miss Wilmot and Mr. Forrester who are just awful and attack Anthony. Like, literally attack him, like tooth and nail attack him. And throughout this entire scene, Anthony describes them as human beasts. And this is the frustrating thing, because like I said, it is the descent. If you look at sort of the ancient Greek setup for, like, where humans fit in the hierarchy of the world, we're about midpoint. There is the divine above us, and there is the beast below us. And this is usually, like, because we have reason. We're higher than the beast because we have reason, but we are not perfect, we are not self-sufficient, so we are not of the divine. And then we supposedly have of the divine up here in this world. Now, is that of the divine the Platonic forms, and thus a more secular version, or of the divine as in a version of Christianity? Because we are told we are investigating a religion. Most notably, Anthony refers to it as something similar to Gnostic religions, Gnostic Christianity. So whether or not we are seeing this in the secular vision or in the religious way, we are not of the divine. We might have pieces of the divine, usually that's reason, right? We might be made in the images of the divine. And again, this can work whether you're looking secular or religious. In the Bible, we're told we are made in the image of God. If you go for the Platonic ideals, well, the Platonic forms are precisely the idea that we're imperfect copies of these perfect ideals, right? That's kind of the point. So we have a spark of the divine in us, but we are not fully divine, but the beasts of the world, the animals, don't have any of this. And yet somehow the forms coming in theory, should move us up towards the divine, especially if they become part of you, which we are told directly in this chapter seems to be what's happening. Miss Wilmot refers to the fact that, like, Anthony says he's got to face up against these, and Miss Wilmot says, like, and if it's part of you, are you going to fight yourself? Are you going to face down yourself? So, they are becoming a part of us. We're sort of a part here, but supposedly Miss Wilmot and Mr. Forrester should have moved further towards the divine in becoming fully combined with these forms. They have it. Like, they drop very notably towards the bestial end of things. And this is a problem that I pointed out prior to this. Like, Mr. Foster making the argument that the perfect ideals are coming through and are drawn to certain human genders because they're gendered ideals. You can already see that human sense of things is being applied to what's supposed to be fully non-human and beyond human comprehension. Now, I recognize that this idea could only be communicated through the human sense, right? It can only be communicated through how far we can understand it. So there are going to be certain human characteristics we apply to the thing we can't understand. When I say Christian God, how many of you picture old bearded man just in the sky? You know what I mean, right? Like, we have to put words to it that we can understand. And this book is definitely trying to do that. But this scene hypes up the animal side of things so far away from the divine side. Like, when we saw the forms separate from humans, we could picture the divinity in the animal form. It is this absolutely massive lion that is not affected by bullets. It is this invisible snake traveling through. It is this magnificent flying being. It is this most beautiful butterfly. You can see the divine in those moments. But it feels almost like you take it, you smash it into humanity, and somehow we're at the lowest of the low, where violence and arrogance and... Well, let's take a look at it. Like, let's look at the scene, right? Because again, it doesn't feel like these are perfect divine beings that just happen to be coming through. They feel like they have a purpose here, and it suddenly becomes a lot like the Greek gods, where like the divine purpose is real petty of, I want to destroy these people because I'm mad, right? They were gazing at him as if they were following the helpless scurrying of some escaping creature, a rabbit perhaps, and he felt the cunning of his restraint laid open to them. She knew all about him, all his ideas, his intentions, his efforts. His defiance was no subtlety, but mere silliness. His intellect acknowledged a greater power of intellect, or rather something which passed through the intellect. He felt like a student who had paused before the expert and in sheer hopelessness began to relax. Like, again, it's like we're looking at you real intensely and judging you. I mean, he uses words like mocking. And what can we tell you, Mr. Durant? And he wondered if the question was or was not inflected with mockery. We're talking about perfect forms, that these two worlds are colliding. That I can believe, right? The idea that these forms simply exist in a greater area of power, and our two areas have come together. But suddenly, we've stepped away from that. This is not just an accident that has occurred through no fault of either side. This has suddenly become, these forms are purposely interfering, and do it almost because we're nothing more than, like, ants that deserve to be squished. Like, that's the feeling here, because he studied Miss Wilmot as he spoke, with a feeling that she was somehow different from what he had expected. But so, he thought at the same time, was Foster. There was something about the man that was more determined, almost more brutal than had been before. The gaze that met his was almost fierce, and its arrogance was the only word. The woman puzzled him. She was, in the queerest manner, gathered up in her chair. Her eyes were half closed, her head every now and then swayed slightly. Nothing seemed to him less like what he had supposed the good, simple creature of Miss Rockbotham's eulogy would be. They're more animalistic. They're more arrogant, mocking, fierce. We're not ascending to a higher point here. Again, this is being dragged down into human beasthood. The woman slid in one involved movement from the chair in which she had sat half-coiled, and from where she lay on the floor at his feet, her arms went up, her hands clutching at his legs, and twisted themselves around his waist. At the same time, the man sprang forward and upwards, hands seizing Anthony's shoulders, head thrust forward as if in design upon his throat. Anthony was aware of their attack just before it caught him. Hardly in time, just in time to throw himself forward to meet it. As they're fighting, all around him in the room were noises of hissing and snarling, and as he staggered aside in the effort to regain his footing, the hot breath of his adversary panted into his face, so that it seemed to him as if he struggled in the bottom of some loathly pit where foul creatures fought for their prey. Where is the ascent that's meant to be happening here? The very first creatures we've met have now moved from this divine grace of these great, awe-inspiring beings to this half-human, half-beast response that is just acting violently. And I would find that okay. I would honestly accept that as an ascent. Because, again, we don't necessarily understand the divine. Maybe the divine is, in fact, a very violent divine. Maybe it is anger and suffering and tearing of skin. That argument could be made. Except the rest of this chapter highlights, again, our lack of sense by keeping to the most mundane humanity. How this scene ends. In that moment, he came to his feet, and lightly as some wheeling bird, turned and poised for any new attack. Again, we should note Anthony's relationship to Bird here, because he noticed there were no birds in a previous chapter when he was investigating with Quentin, and he was one of the first, we're told, to view the great flying creature form that we can assume is in the form of a bird. So it's sort of interesting that we've got Anthony associated to birds here when the other animals are also here, right? Turned and poised for any new attack. But his enemies lay still, their shining eyes fixed upon him, their hands scrambling on the floor. The hissing and snarling, which all this while had been in his ears, ceased gradually. He became aware, as he stepped watchfully backward, of the sedate room in which the horrible struggle had gone on. He took another cautious step away and bumped into the chair on which he had been sitting, and the jerk restored him to his ordinary self. He looked at Miss Wilmot sitting half coiled up on a rug, and Mr. Foster, her visitor, on one knee near to her, as if he were about to pick up a book that lay not far off. With alert eyes on him, Anthony suddenly swooped and lifted it. He remembered what it was without looking. "I was wrong," he said aloud and smiling. "It's perfectly up to date. So sorry to be a nuisance, but I still stick to my own hypothesis. You might think it over. Good night, Miss Wilmot. I'll see myself out. Good night, Foster. Give my love to the lion." He backed carefully to the door, opened it, slipped through, and found the maid hovering in the little hall. She gazed at him doubtfully, and he, still rather watchfully, looked back. Then he saw her expression change into entire amazement and remembered his caller. "Oh, sir," he exclaimed. "Quite," Anthony said. "But Ephesus, you know." "Ephesus, sir?" she asked more doubtfully still as he laid his hand on the door. "My dear," he said, "I'm sorry. I can't give you the reference, but your mistress will. It was where St. Paul had trouble with the wild beasts. Go and ask her. Good night." Like, literally, they just go back to acting kind of normally. Like, Anthony just picks up in his book and is like, "Have a good night." The need for human politeness here continues somehow to reinsert itself. The need not to acknowledge what is happening continues to assert itself. Like, we can't have a plain conversation with Mr. Richardson in the bookseller's store because that might get him in trouble with his boss. Instead, we've got to step around it by asking about books about Gnostic religions and groups similar to them and speak in code. We need to change the subject back to books the moment Martin the bookseller comes closer, because we can't acknowledge what this is. And it happens constantly throughout this chapter. Like I said, with Richardson, with Wilmot and Foster, and how that conversation ended. He steps around it with the maid, even telling her to go into the room where you're well aware those people are possessed by something and will act violently. Like, Anthony does not give a shit about this maid. It happens with Dr. Rockbotham and Mrs. Rockbotham, where Anthony, rather than saying, "I'm concerned about what seems to be happening here," lies fully to their faces and said, "I'm here on behalf of the Two Camps periodical." They have to talk business, but not honestly. When Anthony talks about the Two Camps with Mrs. Rockbotham, well, Anthony obediently sat down and told his hostess as much as he thought good for her about the present stage of the periodical. We are quite possibly looking at the end of the world, but Anthony looks at this rich woman, and whether or not it's because she's rich, whether or not it's because she's a woman, I don't know. but decides that he has to word very carefully his discussion of a business that she seems to be at least partially serving as a patron, and be very careful what he says. Like, that's a very human-esque thing to do. Again, probably to the side of not super good human. Like, Mrs. Rockbotham also says that Damaris has been absolutely delightful about this whole event, and forgiving. And Anthony's like, yes, she has been. He lied. Like, Williams is telling us Damaris hasn't been. Well, just because Damaris doesn't like these people, she's still being nice about the situation by not flipping out in their faces. Like, there is a difference between your actions and your thoughts. And if you can be restrained enough to act politely towards somebody, even if you don't like them, that's a vote in your direction. Like, welcome to customer service. You're gonna have to put up with a lot of people you don't like. And that's actually a good thing if you can do it. You're not a bad person if you get yelled at by a customer for something that's not your fault, and grumble about it to yourself, but keep a smile on your face. This is just the mundane moments that keep inserting itself here that says this is a very human story. This is about certain humans and the human hierarchy. Just every now and then, the platonic forms insert themselves into it and highlight the human interactions. Because this is a human hierarchy. Anthony doesn't like these people just as much as Damaris doesn't, but he's still shitting on Damaris for smiling and putting on a show, despite the fact that he is literally doing the same thing. Mrs. Rockbotham kind of shits on Miss Wilmot, like... so Miss Wilmot is a friend of yours, Anthony threw in casually. We've been connected in a number of things, Mrs. Rockbotham admitted, as if that's a bad thing. Like, she can't say we're friends. The social fetes every summer, and the study group, and the conservative committee. I remember she was a great deal of use with the correspondence at the time of the first winter lectures we had set up to amuse the poorer people. I believe she went to some of them. A good, simple soul. Oh, we're not really friends. We're connected for a few things, but she's a good, simple soul. I mean, social standing, they seem to be relatively close. Like, Anthony has to go through servants of the house to meet either of these people. A maid in Miss Wilmot's case. Is it a maid in... Yep, and a maid at the Rockbothams. It is a maid that he gives his calling card to. They're on the same level, but again, there are levels to it. She's a simple soul who goes to lectures they set up for the poorer people. Ugh. And then, again, to highlight this, we then go on to Richardson. And about who should be part of this group. I suppose Mr. Berenger invited him, though of course he was hardly of the same social class as most of us. Perhaps Mr. Berenger thought that the study of the world of principles, Anthony allowed a gesture to complete his sentence, can be applied to everybody. No doubt, Miss Rockbotham answered, though personally I always think it better and simpler if like stick to like. It simply distracts one's attention if the man next to you rattles his false teeth or can't get up from his chair easily. So this is no longer just about social structure, it's also about ageism, classism, sexism, racism, like sticking to the like. She's distracted if someone doesn't shave properly. Why am I rattling on about this? Because while the attack and the possession of Mrs. Wilmot Miss Wilmot and Mr. Foster, is the end of the chapter. This is here for a reason. And all of this like and the like, it's the human side of things. And not in a positive way. It is the petty nature of humanity, of us versus them, that Anthony, again, is the hero for seeing past. He can not only put up with the Rockbothams, but he likes Richardson. He's an honest, good fellow. And it's sort of this moment of like, oh, you mean like sticking to like. Anthony and Richardson, just in this first conversation, are very similar to each other. Like, they know this code, they know they don't talk about these things in front of other people, they know they certainly don't talk about it in front of Martin. So when the conversation goes to, I'm sorry, we don't have that book, Anthony knows right away, okay, yeah, no, I'll get this one. It's like versus finding like. But when Mrs. Rockbotham espouses that, well, we're not supposed to like her. It's this weird hypocrisy of humanity coming back in, where the forms suddenly aren't divine anymore. They're beasts. They're human beasts. And we can skip back then to the reference to Ephesus. I'm gonna say it wrong. And the reference to St. Paul here. And I went ahead and looked it up. And this is in St. Paul's book of Corinthians. He did historically spend time in Ephesus, the city. And in Corinthians, he says, where I fought the wild beasts. Now, there were, like, actual, like, fighting pits in this city. But more than likely, historically, what actually happened to Paul in this city is he fought with the artisans who were selling statues of Artemis. The wild beasts here are in fact not beasts. They're humans. Humans who think differently than our main character. Because Anthony, again, is calling himself St. Paul in this moment. He called himself Adam, or a son of Adam prior. He is comparing himself to St. Paul here. Because he just fought with the wild beasts. Now, the wild beasts weren't beasts. They were humans who thought differently. But Anthony knows what's happening. And he knows he's going to overcome it. Because he's faced down multiple of these forms now, and is relatively unaffected. He might be a little affected, but he gets over it in time to, like, react properly. We're not talking about a story of divinity or ideals. We're talking about a very human story with human ideas and ideals. And it comes across as petty. Now, we still have plenty of this book to go, so maybe we are going to start seeing the ascent as well. Maybe the descent comes first. Maybe it's a requirement before we get there. But man, have I never felt so disappointed in rereading this text to realize this isn't what I was hoping for. I wanted to deal with the ideals coming in. Instead, I've got human beasts and St. Paul Durant. The guy who's got it all figured out. I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.